Welcome to Seaside Quilting Tutorials. My name is Terry, and today we're going to talk about how to do an easy panel quilt, whether it be for a wall hanging or as a throw quilt, or even turning it into a king-size bedspread type of a quilt. It all starts with a basic. And so I've already done one. Let me grab it for you. In our group, I did a Big Dream panel wall hanging with a fancier border. This one, I believe, is the magenta, which we don't have in stock any longer, or maybe it was rose. I can't remember the names sometimes of them. There's so many different colorings of the Big Dream panels. They became very, very popular. I think they started issuing them out around 2008, and they've been popular ever since. And there's been different colorings, and there's even been some colors that have been discontinued. This particular one is one of the discontinued colorings, and they do have a newer teal Dream Big. This is going to be so hard to hold up, but this one I did with half square triangle borders, and of course quilted it. Now it starts out as a let me see if I turn it this way. Yeah. So you can see the border is a little fancier. It's not super fancy. It was very, very easy. Just a little bit of math that I had to do, which I explained in our group. We have a private Facebook group. You can come along and join. You just need to answer 3 simple questions and agree to our rules, which is just basically be kind to each other in a few forms of how it gets worded, and that's just to protect everybody. And the only reason why we do that is to protect you from the spammers and whatnot that like to come into groups and bug people, and the trollers and the haters and whatnot. We don't need any of that in our world today. There's enough of that out there. We just have a beautiful, lovely group of people. I can't remember how many's in our group now. It's expanded quite a bit over the last 3 years since we put it together. And they're just wonderful people, all the way from beginner sewer and sewists and quilters all the way up to professionals. So there's a wealth of information. There's always sharing of projects, sharing of ideas, sharing, someone might have a question. There's you may not get an instant answer, but there is definitely a wealth of people that are willing to take some time and answer your question the best that they can. And if we can't answer your question, usually we can find a way to direct you to the answers. So there's that. We also have some special sales in there. Let me think. We have tutorials that get posted in there. It's also the place that you can go. We have a, last year we did a sew-along that was a sampler quilt. This year we have our 2023 Seaside Quilt-along, which is, let me grab it for you. Oops, I'm losing papers all over the place. So we've gotten up to block 6 done. Block 7 will come out tomorrow, in fact. And each one, the sashing is a little different in this particular one. It has a 10.5 inch main focus block in each one, and then your sashing that goes around, and it goes around a little different. And I like the way the sashing goes. Please excuse my dog, she's out there barking at stuff. She gets a little noisier at night. So I like the sashing for this because typically when you see sashing done in the quilt, you see it done either around each block and then put together, or strips done between rows of sashing and then sashing around the edge, and then your borders. And the reason that I really, really am in love with this pattern is because you can twist the blocks around, which I'm going to be doing a tutorial on that as well. You can change where they're placed. You could even take other blocks that are 10.5 inches and then put the same sashing around it and come out with a beautiful quilt. It's a wonderful quilt to do as a sampler quilt. For me, I didn't mean sampler, I meant a scrap quilt rather. And the reason is because if you take sashing the same all the way around the quilt, it breaks up those scraps. For me, it's hard to put scraps right next to each other. My brain starts to frazzle over, does this color go with this color? And I'm constantly moving all the pieces around. And I've seen other people do them very, very lovely. It's just not something that is my thing. So I rarely do scrap quilts, but I have tons of scraps, and those scraps keep growing and growing and growing. And I use them in different ways. Sometimes I put scraps together and then I cut them out and make tote bags out of them, all kinds of things. And I'll be sharing some of those things as we go through the rest of this year. We're already in May, almost halfway through May now. And so we're finishing up our 2023 quilt along and doing some tutorials and hints and tricks and tips and stuff in between. And then we'll start to focus on coming up in June and July. We'll start doing some holiday projects and other things. So I really hope that you'll come back and join us. If this is your first time, don't forget to subscribe after you've watched the tutorial. I really hope that you'll enjoy it. So today is just about doing an easy peasy panel quilt. And I'm going to talk to you about whether or not you want it to be a wall hanging, do you want it to be a throw quilt. In the future, I'll be doing different borders with different panels and explaining some of the math that I do to come up with how do I develop my panel quilts. And there's various ways to use them. So anyways, let's get into our project today. It's a very simple, very easy project to do. And so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to adjust the camera. Sorry about the movement. I just want to make sure that you're going to be able to see what I'm doing. My allergies are bugging me today. It was a beautiful day here in Virginia. I'm up in Northern Virginia. Seaside Quilting Supplies LLC is actually about 3 hours from me in Central Virginia. But due to the wonderful world that we live in now, we are able to share from all over the world, and I love that because we're able to share things that we do with other people. This, what I'm working with today is the Whale Song panel by Northcott. Now, I don't always use the exact coordinates that go with a panel. I love panels. I've got stacks of panels. They're a nice quick way for me to throw a present together for somebody, say spur of the moment, a birthday comes up or anniversary or whatever, and I'm going to a party and I need a quick quilt. I know I can put these together really fairly quick and quilt them up pretty quick. Excuse me. So, one of the first things that I decide is on my borders. So I am using the coordinate fabric that goes with it. Now one of them is a little bit darker. This one here is a little bit darker. And I can't remember if this was called sea glass or what. But anyhow, I cannot always remember the names of fabrics, or sometimes even whose line it is. So luckily on the selvage, it will tell me. So that really helps me a lot when I'm trying to tell you. So I have a light and a dark, and these are the actual coordinates that go with this. We did these up as kits, or you could order just the panel. Sometimes I have other fabrics already in on my shelves, and sometimes I already have something else in mind that I want to go with the panel. So sometimes I'll buy the coordinates, sometimes I won't. Sometimes there's so many coordinates that go with it, I just pick out a couple. And so this is what we're working with today. Now typically, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to square up your panel, because sometimes they're cut in yardage, and sometimes they'll have this white separation line on the sides, so the quilt shops and whatnot will know where to cut them and separate them. Other times they'll come in yardage and they're just continuous, and so they get measured out, you're 36 inches, and gets cut and so forth. It just depends on the panels. And then of course you have your selvage on the top and bottom. So we're going to talk about how to square this up. And then the other thing that you're going to decide is, do you want your darker fabric being your first border, or do you want your lighter fabric to be your first border and whatnot? So one of the ways that I do that is I'll lay my fabric out like so, and then I'm gonna, I'm just gonna test this and see. Please excuse my dog. I'm hoping I don't have to go yell at her to be quiet. So I have them together like this, and often, I know it's hard to see this end. So I have this down here. I'm really feeling it's lighter towards the top. A lot of these colors are up in here. They're also down in the bottom here, and it's darker down this way. And so, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll take these, I'll put them on the sides, I'll take pictures of them, and I'll take a look at the pictures, because quite often there are things that we can see in a picture that we don't see just visually looking at it laying on the table. And so I will stack these up different ways. I'll put the dark closer to the edge, and switch them. I'll take pictures of them both ways, and then I'll make a decision based on this, whatever panel I'm working with. Do I want the dark colors first? Do I want the light colors first? In this particular one, I've decided that I'm going to do the light color first, and then I'm going to do the darker as my outer border. I'll be back with you in just one moment. I've got to calm my dog down. Sorry about that. She gets a little barkier in the evening. My husband's away on a trip in Washington for work, and also he's visiting our children while he's there. And she gets a little more protective because she knows I'm all alone, and so every little thing she thinks she needs to bark about it. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at squaring up our panel. And then we'll talk about the borders afterward. So I'm just going to set those aside. I've already pressed this. When I press a panel, I always starch it. Usually I use Best Press starch. Panels do not always come perfectly even. I know it's going to be hard for you to see in the camera, but the two bottoms, I can already tell this side flares out a little bit. That side looks a little bit straighter. I'm not worried about this particular panel because I know that when I square it out and take some of the edging out, I'm not really taking, I'm not going to take very much out of the main picture. Some panels, there's the whole entire panel is one big picture, and you might want to be a little more careful. We do have a link in our group. I believe it's under our files. If you click on files and scroll down, you'll find the link, I believe, in there. If not, I can repost that link. I'll have to take a look and find it again and repost it. That teaches you how to stretch your fabric. I'm not going to do that today. I just want this to be quick and fast. I don't want it to be complicated for you. I don't want you to even have to think about this or worry about this, because I'm doing this mainly for beginners and anyone that just wants to do a quick quilt. I really like this panel because it's not square. The Dream Big panels I'm in love with. Doesn't matter their color. I love them all. I have a large collection of them, sometimes 2 and 3, sometimes even more of one coloring, because they're quick for me to grab and throw together and be able to quilt them. And I can do my fancier quilting in each of the petals. But with this, like I said, I'm not worried about the edge of the picture and if I lose a little bit on the edges. So let's see. You know, usually my tape measure is hanging right there, and at the moment it's not. Weird. Let me grab my other tape measure. Okay, so I have these handy dandy tape measures. I like it because you pull it out and you hit the button and it snaps right back. I love these in my purse. I put them sometimes in totes when I go shopping. They're really nice. We even have some that have little hooks on them that you can put on the outside of your purse or whatever. I keep one in my car. Just because you never know when you're going to need to measure when you're out in the world. And guys, when you're out shopping with them, they never think to bring anything to measure with, and sometimes they need it. So I've always got these handy. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to measure my panel, because I can't remember. I know some panels, I instantly know the size of them. The Dream Big panels are 43 inches by 43 inches. And I do something a little bit different with them when I'm squaring them up. And I can even turn those into a rectangle instead of a square by taking some out of each side. But for today, we're going to keep it simple. So let's measure. And I'm going to measure it without the selvage. Okay, wait a minute. That's not the inches side. I was looking at the wrong side. I'm like, there's no way it could be 60-something inches. Okay, so this one is 42 inches long. And let me see. And, well, it's saying 28 3/4 wide. It's not going to be that when I get done, because I like either half or whole measurements. I hate having to deal with quarters because then my math is a little more complicated, and I'm not going to be complicated with it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to fold it. I already forgot. This is why I have a handy dandy little sticky pad to keep notes on. I've already forgotten my measurements. Can you believe that? And she started barking again. I'm gonna have to bring her inside. Okay, so 42 by, and it depends, you know, just like a quilt, it depends on where I measure it. Like if I measure it here, it says 28 3/4. If I measure it, whoops, in the center, oh, well, it's staying, yeah, 28 3/4. So let me write that down. I'm going to be right back one more time, and I'm going to bring the dogs in so they stop their barking. I have two beautiful chows. One of them is a barker, and the other one hardly ever barks. The other one, if she barks, I know to go and check out what is she barking at, because she hardly ever barks. And the other one barks at every little thing, especially when I'm home alone. And so when I bring them in, when she's been barking, I'll tell them that they're grounded. And then she'll hang her head and walk along, because she knows now that that means she's in trouble and she got to stay inside. Okay, so I'm going to fold this. I'm going to do the length of it first. So I do want to keep them for my own personal benefit. I'm going to keep them so that they're in equal increments. All right, let me grab a couple pins. Because one of the things that I do is I want to make sure that this is folding very nicely up in here, not a wave in my fold, or it won't come out nice. But I will take a pin and I'll go right in the very corner, that bottom corner, and I'm going to poke a pin through, and then I'm going to look for the print. Now this print, probably as it was going through the machine, and I'll try to get this closer for you, the print went down into the selvage. So this is the side that's a little crooked. Because the printing went down into the selvage. It didn't stay above the selvage. So I'm going to, and at this end of it, it's printed above the selvage. So I know immediately that's not going to be perfectly straight. So I'm going to go in the corner just above the selvage. And I'm going to put a pin in there, because I want to keep this as straight as I can without it having any kind of a wave when it's folded. And you can tell, you can feel if it's waving, you can see if there's a wave in it, if it's not folded straight. Some things are just harder to show on a camera. And I don't have any kind of a camera crew. So I'm kind of on my own here. Now I am going to, now that I've got my corners matched up the way that I want, I'm just continuing to make sure that I don't have any wave in my fold. But I want this to be, the selvages to be as even as possible. And it's not going to be perfect because of the printing of the panel. This is beautiful fabric. I love the feel of Northcott fabric. It has a beautiful drape to it, has a beautiful feel. Now I can see that on this side, my selvage is just, if I pull it all the way down, then my corners don't stay matched up for my print. So the selvage here, it's gonna be up a little bit from the other selvage. So there's about 1/8 of an inch difference. And I'm not going to be able to get this perfect up against each other, the two selvages, because of how it was printed. And I'm not worried about that, except that when I trim my selvage off and square this up, I do not want to have this side, if I follow this side where there's a thinner selvage on this end of it, if I was to cut it right to the selvage, I'm going to have some white showing on the bottom of it, and I do not want that to happen. So I'm going to use this side to cut at the selvage, and then I know on the other side it's going to be a print. Because it's very disappointing when you square it all up and then you go to put your borders on and you notice that you have a small strip of white that's showing through. So I want to make sure that I'm going to get that out. So that tells me that I need to fold it this way. So that when I cut that selvage out at the bottom, I'm not going to have to worry. Now I am going to lose a little bit of the length of the quilt, and I'm going to have to, or the panel rather, and I'm going to have to remeasure. But I do make sure, since this is my fold line, I do make sure that I put my selvage together from the sides, and I'm going to put a little pin in there to keep that together. And I want this to be nice and flat and flush all the way across, top to bottom. I don't want the top piece to be up above or below the fold line on this side. I want them to be equal to each other. So I do go and I do put a couple pins in to keep this nice and straight, so as I'm straightening the bottom, I'm not shifting my fabric. And I know this takes a little extra time to do this pinning, but it will help me to make sure that I square up my panel nice and get it done pretty well. And I'm getting a little folding on the edge, which is just bugging me at the moment. So I'm going to ease this, and it's just frustrating me. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to take this folded side and I'm going to put it up to a line. And I'm going to make sure that this folded piece stays straight on a line going across, and that the top is staying straight on a line. Of my mat. So I can try to make sure that I'm getting a nice straight cut when I'm cutting across. And I'm going to take these two pins out now. And the selvages are just off from each other, and I'm, like I said, I'm not worried about that. I'm just worried that I have this nice and straight here, that I have this nice and straight here on a line. This is straight on a line. Ow. Picking myself with my pins. And once I have this line, so I have a solid line here and I have a solid line here, and I'm just making sure that my fabric is up against both those lines. Okay, so now we're going to make our cut. And the most important thing that I'm looking for is that I'm getting all that selvage out. Now when I go on this line here and I look at my ruler, if I cut it right here, I'm going to have a little bit of that white selvage at the bottom. And there's too much of it that the border, when I sew my 1/4 of an inch seam, is not necessarily going to cover that white. So I'm going to go and I'm going to move my ruler up just a little bit. And I'm using the lines of my ruler with the lines, because I only want to go up about a 1/4 of an inch from the edge of that selvage. And because this is a little crooked here, due to how it was printed, it's almost to the selvage right here in the center, and it's about 1/8 of an inch away from the selvage down here, but it is going to square it up. So I'm between, halfway between my whole marking and my half marking on my mat, and I'm using the line on my ruler to make sure it's directly on the line of my mat, so I can see that it's going to be a nice straight cut. So just so that I can show you what I'm doing is I have this up here, it's on a whole line, which are my lighter blue lines on my mat, and on this side as well. And like I said, because if I put my ruler, so the edge of my ruler is on the hole marking, the lighter blue, I'm going to have too much white. So I know that I needed to back my ruler up. And the Creative Grids rulers have your 1/4 inch on one side and 1/2 inch on the other side. And it's kind of, it's got that grippy stuff underneath, and you can easily see the marking, and they mark it. Let me see if I can get something white to put behind that so that you can see the markings here. There's these little dashes that go across on my ruler right here. There's little tiny dashes right there. And that's showing me where my 1/4 inch on my ruler is. Now when I moved my ruler back, I'm making sure that these dashes line up with the line on my mat, on each end. And by doing that, I know that I'm going to end up with a nice straight cut. And I'm also making sure that going across, that it's lined up with the fold, because I have my fold directly on that line. And I'm making sure that my dash lines are matched up with the line that I need to match it up with on both ends, so I can tell that I'm going to get a nice straight cut. I always double check, sometimes triple check before I cut, because once you cut, you can't put it back. If you cut too little, that you can fix. If you cut too much, you can't fix that. So I always double check. My lines are all matched up where I need them to be. And so now I'm going to do my cut across. And this is going to change how long it is. And so I will measure it to see afterward that I have a measurement that I like for my panel. Okay, so I've cut off my selvage. Sometimes I save these, sometimes I don't. You can do different projects with selvages. This one's not overly exciting. It doesn't have the little colorings, because with panels they come with coordinates that go with them most usually. So not always do they put your little colored dots down here, but I like the fancier ones that will have either little pictures down here, or they'll have they have your, of course, your cleaning instructions for the fabric, but sometimes they'll have those little color dots down here, so you can take a selvage to a quilt shop or online and you can match them up. So I have a basket down here that I put selvages in, and I put scraps in and whatnot that I use for stuffing and all kinds of things. So let me measure this. See where we're measuring at now. And I'm at 20 3/4. That's gonna bug me. That's gonna bug me. So I need to take another 1/4 inch off my bot. Wait a minute, let me see. I always have to do this math in my head. Now I could unfold this whole thing and measure it and see if it comes out, but I know that if it's, and right now it's measuring 20 3/4, so that would be 41, and the 2/4 should bring me at a half. Okay, I think this should be good, so I'm going to leave it. Now I'm going to twist it around, and once again now I have a straight cut to go by now, so I'm not going to worry about my fold up there because I have a nice straight line on my bottom, and I'm going to make sure that this side of the fold goes onto a straight line. And I just press it down to make sure that it's fully laying flat on that line the way that I want it. I'm not worried about this end this edge that I'm going to cut. That I'm not worried about. And I make sure that my straight edge is on a nice line, and it is. I am going to measure this for just a moment to see if where I'm going to cut it, if it's going to give me a whole number. So if I cut it, let me see. If I cut it, and sometimes I use a couple rulers to do this. I'm going to want to cut this on the half marking on my ruler. I'm going to take this pin out of this corner. Okay, so if I line this up like this. Okay, so if I put it on, okay, so I can see with my ruler and with this, and I do need to take this tape measure out. You know, I've forgotten to do that before. And without even thinking about it, cut my tape measure in half. But I use those for other projects now, and yep, I've done it. Now if I go directly on this line, I can tell I'm going to end up with too much white down in this corner. So once again, I'm going to have to move over so that that 1/4 of an inch on my ruler is matching up with the halfway mark. This is the 1/2 inch, this is the whole inch. If I put it on the whole inch, down here, because it's printed and it's slanted, it's got a slant to it, so it's like up here and then it slants down. And I want a nice straight line. And even if I do end up on, you know, like say it measured 20 3/4, that's not a big deal. If you're only putting a couple borders on and you're not doing any fancy borders and whatnot, so it's not such a big deal. So I'm going to make sure that I have a straight line going across on my straight edge that I cut before. I'm making sure that my little dashes are matching up with the line that I'm using on my cutting mat. I can see I am going to lose a little bit of my edge. There's no doubt. And it's because it's printed at a slant. It's just how, you know, even robots and machinery are not perfect. We're human and we make mistakes. Nothing that we do is absolutely 100% perfect. But I swear to you that even machines are not 100% perfect all the time. Because humans run them. Okay, so I've double checked, I've triple checked. Now I'm gonna make my straight edge cut. Getting time to change. When you can't cut all the way through, all the way down on a long line, you know it's getting close to time to changing your blade. So let me show you. When I cut my straight line, And I'm hoping that you'll be able to see this. You can see it's a little straighter down here. Look how much off it was on the measurement. See how, you know, I've only lost a little bit of the edge up here, but down here I had to take that much off in order for me to get what I needed. Now before I unpin this or unfold this, I'm going to check my bottom. And it's a good thing that I did, and I'll show you why. Because right down here, if I would have unfolded it, let me see if I can get this so that you can see it. See how on the back side it still has a little bit of that white. And there's too much of it that when I go to sew my 1/4 of an inch, it may pop through. So I'm going to cut just a little bit more off this side. And like I said, I'm not worried about losing some of the edge on this quilt because it's not going to affect the main print of it. And this is probably the longest part of doing a panel, is getting your actual panel straight. So once again, I'm going to use my straight edge down there to make sure that I have it going on a line on my ruler. And I'm going to scooch up. I also have this edge all on a line, the fold. And let me see. I'm going to, I don't want to take a lot off at this point. I'm just going to take off a little bit on the edge, probably about, approximately 1/4 of an inch. And once again, I'm using markings on each end of my ruler on the main lines of my mat. I'm making sure that my straight edge that I cut before is on a solid line, and I double check everything to make sure that it's perfectly lined up the way that I want. And I can hear when I've cut all the way through my fabric or I haven't. And I know I still didn't get a little bit down at that end. Sometimes it's because of how I hold my rotary cutter. Okay, so I didn't take a super lot off that last time, just a little bit. So I'm just gonna, before I unfold this, because it's a pain to fold it back and get everything lined up again, I'm just double checking both the bottom and the side. I'm flipping it over and I'm double checking, and I'm even going to check these layers on the inside to make sure that I don't have white showing. Now I have just a sliver of the selvage over on this side, but it's just a sliver. So I know when I do my 1/4 of an inch, that's not gonna show up. And because of the tone of it, if it does show up, it's just gonna look like some of this squiggly white that's already in the quilt. So I'm not worried, that's all good. I'm gonna check this bottom. Everything looks good. So now I can take my pins out. I'm gonna need my tape measure so I can measure and see what measurement we have now. So we started out, it was 42 by 28 3/4. Now you cannot follow the exactness of size on every panel because fabric shifts as it goes through rollers and machines. There was a woolen mill back in my hometown up in Maine, and I had friends that worked there, and I got a tour one time and I got to see how fabric, it was a woolen mill, but it's the same thing. The fabric, how it goes through the rollers, how it goes through and gets dyed, and all this processing that happens, and then how it gets rolled onto bolts. And when you see it go through, people are fishing that into the rollers, and which grabs your fabric and twirls it around on the rollers and so forth. And so depending on how that person passed it through, and things have gotten better than they were even back then, and that was like about 20 years ago, and some of the processes of printing and doing fabric has gotten way better. But at the same time, these are not always printed perfect. You can manipulate a panel by pressing and putting some heat in it and stretching it and so forth. I don't like to go through all that. I just want to make sure that I end up with nice straight cuts on my sides. And I'm going to measure. And this is my last check on my quilt. So I've ended up with, you know, because I took my selvage off the top and the bottom, I'm at 41 and a half. Right there, I'm just a little off in the middle. And I'm at 41 and a half at the bottom. So, or at that side. So I'm going to go with the 41 and a half. It's a little less right here in the center than 41 and a half. Because when you fold fabric, that changes and shifts everything. But I'm going to stick with that 41 and a half since that's the two measurements on each end. And that's going to end up squaring up my center when I put my borders on. So let me write that down so I don't forget. I'm at 41 and a half long. And I do 3 measurements, and I do this with all of my quilts, not just panels. This is how I square up quilts and put my borders on the proper way. So I'm at 28 and a quarter, 28 and a quarter, and the top is just like 28 and 4/8, or 3/8 rather. So I'm going to, oh, my brain. If only it would cooperate with me. Yeah, 28 and a quarter. So I started out with 42 inches long. It's now 41 and a half. That wasn't counting my selvage. I did not measure it from selvage to selvage, mind you. Because I knew I was cutting that off. So I was only measuring my main print. And I only lost a half an inch on my sides. Not a big deal. It didn't change. No one's going to notice. The little bit that we lost off of the edges, nobody's going to see it. So let's talk about borders. And I'm just going to set that over there for the moment. So there's this theory of using odd numbers when you do borders. So if you do, say, a 3 inch or a 1 inch border, sometimes people like to do, and I often like to do, is I'll do a solid color or a matching fabric to go around my edges. And a lot of times I like to use black or I like to use white because it will pop the colors. Sometimes, depending on the colorations, I may use a yellow or whatever that goes with it, and I'll do that around the edge, and usually that'll be a 1 inch border. I typically like 3 borders, sometimes more. Depends on, for me, I'm always thinking about what am I going to be quilting on here. So, because I'm in this master feather class, I'm going to want some big borders, and that's going to make this larger. Now, if you want this to stay typically a wall hanging, I would do, and I know that everyone, not everyone, but the majority of people say, well, stay with odd numbers. So if you do a 1-inch border, then do your second border 3 inches. Typically, I do 3 borders, so sometimes I'll do like a 1 inch, which means I'm cutting my fabric strips at 1.5 inches. They will end up being 1-inch borders. Okay, so a lot of times that will be my first border. I'm not doing that today. I'm only doing 2 borders today. And we sell a lot of our kits that way. We also sell 4 fabric kits, so there would be your panel and 1 yard of each of the other fabrics. Or we do the 3, which is your panel, and 1 of each of 2 coordinates. This is what I'm working with, is a kit that has 2 coordinates, so I'm going to be only doing 2 borders today. I want wide borders for my practice on borders. Right now in my master's quilting class, we're working on techniques for borders, so I want 2 wide borders on here. One of the things, like I had mentioned before, that you want to think about, do I want this to stay a wall hanging? If you want it to stay a wall hanging, you may not want it to get super large, okay? Because it's got to take up wall space. And so you've got to think about that. So you would maybe want to do thin borders, maybe do a 1-inch border and a 3-inch border. Some people don't care about the numbers. I'm a rule breaker, so I don't always go by odd numbers. Sometimes I go by even numbers. So I may do my first one at 2 inches, my next one at 4 inches, and my last one 6 inches. Those are my whole numbers, but I'm always cutting. So if I'm doing a 1 inch or a 2 inch, my first border, it's going to be 1.5 inches cut or 2.5 inches cut, because you need to add on your seam. So there's that. Then and I don't always double my number either. I'm an odd person. I may do my first border at 1 inch, my second border at 3 or 4 inches, and my last border, sometimes that'll be a very wide border, because I'm going to do a lot of quilting in that last border, which is a little more showy. And because I'm trying to create a larger quilt. So if I wanted this to be a lap quilt per se, I would do, my last border would be very, very wide. I might even go as far as to do an 8-inch border for my last border. Doing 3 borders, I might go 2 inches, 4 inches, and then 8 inches. That would give me a nice long lap quilt and wider. I like to give people room to cover up. It's just how I am. I always end up with larger quilts. We're going to keep this one, so I'm going to do my first border 3 inches. So this is going to end up being pretty long for me. So if I do my first one 3 inches, which means I'm cutting my strips at 3.5 inches, that's going to extend my sides an extra 6 inches. So it will end up being 12, 4. So it will end up being 34 inches wide from my first border. When I add my second border, it's going to bring it out to, let me see if I do 6 and 6, that's going to be 12. It'll end up being 56 inches wide and probably 70 something inches long. It will end up being pretty close to a throw quilt or a lap quilt. And that's going to be fine for this. I'm really gonna like that because, like I said, I need wide borders for my quilting. So that's where my mindset is at right now. But like I said, if you want to keep this a wall hanging, you don't want it to get a lot larger than the picture that it is, I would just go with a 1-inch border and a 3-inch border. Very simple, very quick, very easy. And so if you go with the 1 and the 3-inch, you would cut 1.5 for your first border, 3.5 for your second border. Okay, so I've already starched this with best press. I'm going to lay it out so that it doesn't wrinkle while I'm working on getting my borders ready. Okay, so one of the things that I love, and I did a whole tutorial on using this particular ruler. Here it is. This is your Stripology. This is the extra large. There's a, I believe there's a large, there's an extra large, and then there's some smaller ones and whatnot. And there's even ones that have 1/8 markings in them and so forth. This just has your whole and your 1/2 inch markings in it. This is really nice because you can cut your strips any size that you want. So I use this when I'm cutting strips. I use it for other things too, squaring up blocks and so forth. I've done, like I said, a tutorial on using this particular ruler. There's some other tutorials out there on using the ruler that go even more extensive than what I did in mine. But I mainly use this for my strip cutting. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to press each one of my fabrics with best press, and then we'll take a look at cutting them out I'm going to use the Stripology ruler. I will show you how to use your regular ruler in order to cut your strips. So let me go ahead and press my fabric and I'll be right back. Okay, so I have my fabrics all pressed. I folded it selvage to selvage. And now I'm going to give it one more fold. Like so. Making sure that I have it lined up straight. Now my edges aren't straight, that's fine, because my first cut is going to straighten it out. Now before I do that, I'm going to do a little bit of math. Usually I use my calculator, but today I'm just going to do it by hand. So I have 41.5 and I have 28.25. I'm just going to bring that up to 28.5. I round out to either half numbers or whole numbers when I'm doing borders, just cutting the strips. So let me see. So I add my width and my length. Okay, and then I'm gonna tie, so I added my width and my length, so I added 41.5 by 28.5. Now I'm gonna times that by 2 because I have 4 sides. So I'm gonna times that by 2, and that gives me 140 inches. Now I need to divide that by 42, okay? So I need 140 inches of fabric for my borders. So 42 inches is my length of my fabric. So I'm going to divide, and I'm not good at doing division without my calculator because I always use my calculator. I should have done this ahead of time. Let me see, 42. 42 is going to give me 84. Okay, so do the, let me see, 2, 2. So I need 4 strips basically. Oh, wait a minute, I can't do that either. Let me think. Okay, let me go back. Let me go back. Skip what I just said. Because your measurement's going to change. I wasn't thinking. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I know that I'm going to need, I'm going to need 2 strips because of the 41.5. So I know I'm going to need 2 strips, 1 for each side. Those 2 strips, they're going to be 3 inches wide. So I'm adding 6, so that's going to be 34. So yeah, I'm going to need 4 strips. Okay, so I'm going to take my ruler and I line up one of my straight lines on my ruler with a fold, preferably one that I can see very well. There we go. And I'll get it as close to the edge as I can so I can get my first straight cut with my ruler. And if you're doing this with a regular ruler, you'll just put your fold so it's on a straight line. And then you will use one of the lines on your mat to get your first straight cut. And then you can use your ruler. So I'm going to be cutting my first ones at 3.5. You would just cut each of your strips at 3.5 inches after you get your straight cut. But since I'm using the Stripology ruler, it's a lot quicker. I can just line up on my fold a straight line. Move it as close as I can to know that I'm going to achieve that straight line at the end. So I'm going to lose a little bit of fabric on my edge. Keep your fingers away from your cutter. I've cut my finger before. Okay, that did go through. So I'm cutting my first ones at 3.5 inches. 7. Okay. So then I'm going to take each of my strips and I will lay them out and I will cut off the selvage on the ends. And that's going to give me my 42 inches on each one of my strips. And you will do the same thing for your other one. Now this just depends on how wide you wanted your borders. Like I said, I wanted my borders to be the 3 inch and the 6 inch. So I'm cutting them at 3.5, and for the first border, 6.5 for the second border. And I typically line these up in a row. Because it's quicker for me to cut them. I'm going to move that piece out of the way. We don't want that in the way. Now the extra coordinates that coordinating fabrics that I have, the extra that I have from the fabric with the kit, I will be using them to create my backing. I may put like another fabric in with them and I'll create a backing for it. So they'll get set aside and saved. And so now I'm just going to line this up. take off my selvages. And I just take off my selvages ahead. You don't really have to. You could measure and cut these and take them off, each one separate. I'm just doing all 4 together because it makes it quicker. But I am going to move my hand up and hold it to make sure that these other pieces don't shift as I'm cutting. So I'll just stop with my rotary cutter, move my fingers up, and I'll cut all the way up the row, and then all my selvages are off each piece. That just makes it faster for me. Okay, so the 2 side borders are my length, so I need them to be 41.5 inches. So I'm going to take 2 of these strips and I will lay them out on my mat, making sure that they're lined up, that this is on a straight edge down here. And I will do these individually, actually, so I make sure I get them accurate. I cut my borders to the length that I need them to be. Now, if I need a lot of strips for my sides of a quilt, I will often sew each of these to each other, then cut them out to the length. That way, that's if I need, like, say my side is my sides are 60 inches. 42-inch length is not going to be enough. I'm going to need to add some. Knowing that ahead of time, I will sew all my strips of my borders together and then I will cut them, and that shifts where those seam lines are. So when you look at the quilt, you don't see exact seam lines across from each other. And I will even shift where my seam lines are. So if I have seams in my borders, I will make sure that one seam is up on this side and the other seam is down here on this side, because it shifts it and your eyes don't go to it when you're looking at your quilt. And that's, you know, the same when I do a quilt as when I do a panel. Okay, so I need these to be 41.5 inches for the first 2. And it, you know, if you're doing this on your own, after you know how to do it, it goes a lot quicker since I'm explaining it to you and doing it. And I'm trying to give you as much information as I can. Once you've done a few of them, they go really, really fast. Barb showed one, not the last live, but the one before that. She showed one that she did, and she did it in 1.5 hours. And that's because she already has done these multiple times. Now I'm curious. I'm telling you, you gotta double check, double check, double check. For some reason, I'm not cutting as. I cut that one wrong. Can you imagine that? Right in front of an audience. Okay, I'll just need to cut one more strip. That's fine. Okay. I'm supposed to be 41.5. I cut my other one at 40.5 because I'm talking. And when I'm talking and cutting, which don't go well together, I'll just tell you right now, I sometimes goof. But I'm human. We're all human. This is why I tell people to double check. But when I'm talking and trying to cut at the same time, stuff can happen. So I will cut myself one more strip afterward. Okay, So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take these two strips that I have, and I'm going to attach them to the sides of my panel. And then we will come back and we will measure it again across the width of it to find out once we've added. Now I can do the math pretty easily, but I'm going to measure them just to make absolutely sure. I think they're going to come. It's going to come out to 34 inches for my other two. But before I cut and make a boo-boo again, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to add these on to our panel. Okay, so I'm going to pause and I'm going to move the camera over to the sewing area because I want to show you how I attach my borders. Okay, so here we are at the sewing machine. I've got my panel, I've got my two sides, my left and my right that's going on to my panel. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my panel in half on one side. And I'm just going to make a small crease at the halfway mark. You could put a pin there if you want. Sometimes I will do that just so in case you can't see your crease. I'll put a little pin there to remind me of where my center is on that side. I do the same thing for quilts as I'm doing now. And I always make sure that I cut my borders. Helicopter going by, making a lot of noise. I always cut my borders to the exact length and width that I'm going to need them. If you sew a border on and then just trim it at the end, you will end up with wavy borders. So when someone goes to put this on a long arm or on a sit down or on a domestic machine and they quilt it, you're going to end up with wavy borders, and sometimes that can cause creases in your borders when they go to quilt it because they can't quilt it out. It depends on how much quilting they're putting in. If they're doing an edge to edge, it's not going to suck in as much of the quilt. I do a lot of fancy quilting on my borders, so it takes up more and less times do I end up with creases. This is the better way to put your borders on. Trust me on it. They won't, when you're using quality fabric, you will not end up with those wavy borders by doing it this way. Some people, even some professionals, do it where they'll, start at one end, they just sew their border on and they trim it at the end. I do not like to do that. I have had problematic borders over and over doing it. There will always be that one or two people in a group that will say, well, I always do it that way, blah, 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 and it works every time. And maybe it does for them. I've had so many problems when I get to the quilting part of it with borders that are attached that way. And a lot of my customers attach their borders that way. And I have to do a lot of extra work to make sure that I flatten. I have to extra starch them. I have to do a lot of extra work to flatten out their borders so that they do not look bad, and so that I can square them up better. And I can tell the difference when I'm stitching in the ditch on them. Now I'm going to do the same thing because I've cut it. I've got this crease mark from where it was originally folded, but because I cut it a different size, I need to find what the center of this is. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to fold my border in half, and I'm going to make a new crease mark. And you're going to put right side to right side, making sure that I use the crease that I just made, not the fold from when I was cutting it. And I'm going to match my two centers together. And I'm going to put a pin, or you can clip, whichever works better for you. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to pin or pin or clip my ends, okay? And I just like to use clips for this, and I do put quite a few clips going along, and I'll tell you, if you don't, fabric will shift. If you're not using a walking foot, your fabric feeds at a different rate under those feed dogs than it does under your foot. And so you can get to the end and find out that your border is shorter than your panel or your quilt. So I put a lot of clips on, and that makes sure that my fabric doesn't shift and it feeds more evenly. Now your modern machines are really nice because you can tell them what type of fabric you're sewing, and it tensions it better and feeds it better. So now that I have the center and the edge, I'm going to start from the center, and I'm going to do a couple of clips from the center over. And then I'm going to go to the end, because I'm working to the center of this side of my border, okay? So I'm going to do a couple clips from the edge over. I know this is going to sound weird, but the first few times that I cut borders to go on my quilts, I went to attach them, and when I got to the end, they weren't. I was thinking, wow, it's not fitting on there proper, and I had more quilt than I had border, and I'm like, but I cut my borders properly. I double checked them, everything, and then I understood why the woman that I was watching said to start from the center, work down a little bit, then work from your edge, and line them up. And I can't explain to you what happened the first couple times that I was doing it, but they weren't coming out right. And now I have found that this works perfect for me. Okay, so I have this side all clipped, and as you can see, I've put quite a few clips on there. I've got 2, 4, 6, 7 clips, and then my pin. And I even do another extra clip down this edge because I want to keep my edges straight. I don't want this to shift over and go crooked on me, so I put an extra clip there. Now originally when I first started sewing, I can tell you that I didn't know all these rules. I didn't, or tips in doing things, and ended up with a lot of problems way back when I first started. So it's nice to learn why things happen with a machine. So I sometimes maybe over explain things a little bit, but I can't know for sure if you've watched my other tutorials and if you've heard me say these things before. So the ones of you that are watching, who watch all my tutorials, you're like, man, she said that so many times. But it's because each time when I do a tutorial, I'm trying to think this could be the first time that you've ever watched one of my tutorials, and you may not have heard all this information before. So yes, I do sometimes over-explain things. And so some of you can just fast forward through some of my stuff and say, oh, I've already heard that blah, blah, blah before. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I've got my center. I've done my 2 clips at the end, one for the side and one for the top. And I'm just going to do a couple of clips from the end. Doesn't really matter if you start in the center or start in the end. Either way, it's going to work out. But I do a couple from the edge, and then I'll do a couple from the center. Do not ask. I do not know logically why this works better. But I've had times when I've gone from the center all the way to the edge, and then had this, when I get to the end, be a little more over and couldn't figure out why. And for some reason, this always works doing it this way. And I have no logical explanation for why that can happen when you just go along and clip it. Don't know. I just know that this works, so I stick with what works and I don't question it. Okay, so I have it all clipped. I have my center here. I've got a lot of clips in it, so I know that my fabric's not shifting. When I sew a border on, I always, or almost always, sew with my border being the top and my quilt or my panel being on the bottom. So, just as a reminder, I have my stitches at a 2.0 stitch length, and I'm using a scant 1/4 inch. With a panel, you could go with a true 1/4 inch because you're just doing some borders on the side. Doesn't need to come out exact. If you're just doing plain borders on the side, you could go just 1/4 inch. It wouldn't matter. When I do blocks or I do a fancier border, I do the scant 1/4 inch. And I'm so used to using scant 1/4 inch now that I just use scant 1/4 inch. It's just become a habit, and so that's what I always use. Okay, so we're going to sew along our edge, taking our clips off. When we get to them, I leave them in until I get almost to it, and then I remove them and continue. So go ahead and sew your two borders on. You're going to sew your border on this side, and then afterward you will do the same thing to your other side. And once these are sewn on, we'll go back over to, we'll remeasure, we'll press, and we'll remeasure to find out what size we need for the width, for the top and the bottom for our borders. So I'm not going to sit and do all the sewing in front of you to eliminate some of the time in the video, because I'm assuming that you know how to sew. And so we're just going to, I'm going to go ahead and sew these so you don't have to watch me do the sewing part. And then when I press, I'm just going to press across and set my stitches, and then I will fold this out and I will press, and my seam will be going out towards the edge, not in towards the center, but out towards the edge. And I'm going to press all the way through. Don't iron, just press. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to sew the two sides on. I'm going to press it open on both sides, and then we'll come back at my table and we'll do our measurements, and we'll get our other two border, the top and the bottom border ready to attach. Okay, so now we have both sides attached. And I've pressed them. Now, if your fabric on the outside of your panel or your quilt is lighter than the fabric here, you would press your seams to the dark side. This outer fabric isn't so light that it's showing my seams, so I was fine with pressing it and having my seams go towards the outside. So now, grab my little tape measure. Now, the way I had figured it is that this was 28 1/4 before we added our borders. The two borders are going to add 6 inches, 3 inches this side, 3 inches this side. Add that together, and I believe I came up with 34 inches in my math. Let me see if my math was right. And there we go, 34 inches. So now what we'll do is we'll take, now I had that one piece that I had cut too short for the length, but it's still long enough, luckily, that I don't have to cut another piece out of my fabric. I can just cut this one even shorter. So I have no waste of fabric, which is nice. So my boo-boo wasn't so big that it can't be fixed. So I'm going to cut these two at 34 inches. And this is really the only time, I rarely use my mat for measurements. I use my rulers for my measurements. Because your mat is never going to be the same exact measurements as your ruler. Make sure that's lined up right. And I save these pieces for my scrap pile. And we'll get our other one to 34 inches. And like I said, this is a lot quicker once you know how to do them. And I think a lot of times, I didn't used to buy panels because I was like, what are you going to do with a panel? But there's a lot of things that you can do with panels. And we'll be taking a look at different things that we can do with panels coming up. So now we're going to do the same exact thing to the top and bottom that we did with the sides. We will fold this in half. We will find our center, okay? Put a pin in there, make a crease, whatever. Do the same with your border, and then you will pin and clip all the way across. And you will do your scant 1/4 of an inch seam and press it with your seam going out or towards the dark side, whichever that you're working with. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to attach, I'm going to do the pinning and clipping, and I'm going to attach the top and bottom, and then we'll come back and we will do our second border, which is going to be our last border for this one. Now you can do as many borders as you want. There are no quilt police out there. So if you want a bigger quilt, so say you're working with a small 23 by 42 panel, and you want it to be a throw size, you would add, you know, a border or two extra, or make your borders wider. I needed 3 inches and 6 inches because of what I know I'm going to be quilting into the borders. So I need that space to be able to, the last border is going to have a fancier feathering border. I can't remember, I've drawn out a pattern that I'm going to use for this border. And so I knew what size I need to be able to quilt within. So the other question that comes up is, well, how do I quilt this? If you don't have a long arm, if you don't free motion quilt, I honestly, you know, have never taken a panel quilt to a long armor even before I could free motion quilt. But what I used to do, and I still sometimes do it, is I will mark out a quilt top with some water soluble marker or chalk, and you can do diagonal lines every so many inches. You could do so you could do just diagonals, or you could do diagonals this way and then diagonals that way. Or you could just do straight lines from bottom to top. You will want to use a walking foot. It's highly recommended. If you use a regular foot, they're going to feed at different rates. You're going to have a backing, a batting, and a top. too much shifting in the fabric. You want to pin, or use spray starch to put your sandwich together, which is your backing, batting, and your top. And then plan out how you're going to do your stitching. But the important thing to remember is if you're going to do just straight lines from top to bottom to quilt this, and then stitch in the ditch for your borders, the one thing that's very, very highly important to remember is if you start on the bottom and sew straight up to the top, or even in a diagonal, okay, your next, when you sew the next time, you're going to want to start from the top and go to the bottom, and then from the bottom to the top. If you always go from the bottom to the top and then bottom to the top, you're going to end up with ripples in that top. And then all of a sudden, when you get over to this side, you're going to find that you can't sew a straight line that's smooth. It's going to cause a crease in your quilt. And that's because of the shifting of fabric between, even though it's pinned and all that, it will shift. So you, if you were going to use straight lines or diagonals, so say you're using diagonals, I would go this way for my first line, then I would start up here and I would do my next line here, up, then from here down. That makes it nice and smooth by shifting where you're starting your sewing from. And these really, because your main picture is already there. You don't have to do a lot of fancy quilting on a panel. So you can easily do the diagonal lines. You can do them going just one way if you want. You could do them one way and then go the other way. Or you can do from top to bottom or side to side, straight lines, and it'll still be beautiful because the main thing is that picture that's on that panel. It doesn't need a lot of fancy sewing. And so I really feel like taking it to a long armor, you're going to put an awful lot of extra money into that quilt when it can easily be quilted right on a domestic. If you do know how to free motion quilt, well, that's handy, and so you could do some fancier edge to edge or whatever on it. But I do get that question quite often, is that, well, you know, I don't know how to do free motion quilting. I don't have a long arm. How am I going to quilt this? And you can very easily do it with a walking foot. And I've showed this back when I did the heart pillow tutorial. I showed you how you could do it with a walking foot and just do your crisscross lines. So there's that you can go take a look at. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to put my top and bottom on, we'll come back and we'll measure and we'll cut for our outer border. So now we have all of our border strips applied. We first did the sides and then we did the top and the bottom. And it's looking really, really beautiful. I'm really glad that I used this as the first fabric. Now we're going to put our second border on. So just as a refresher, this was cut at 3.5 inches wide, and now we have 3 inches extra on each end. So we're going to do the same exact thing that we did for our first borders. We need to measure. So I do 3 measurements, and I do this the same way on quilts as I do on these panel tops. So this is 47.25 there. Let's see. 47.25 in the center. And I have to stretch a little bit. And 47.25 on that side. So that's wonderful. It doesn't always happen that way, more on panels than on tops, believe me. So now we know that our first 2 strips need to be cut at 47 inches and a quarter. So I'm going to write that down, because you never know when you step to the side, go to do something else. It's easy to forget, and then you have to measure again. Okay, so we know the measurement for that. We're going to cut our strips. Now, I know since this is 47 and a quarter long, 1 strip isn't going to make it all the way to the end, so it's going to need an additional piece. And like I said before, whenever I have to do that, I will make sure that 1 seam goes up in this side and 1 seam goes down in this side. That way they're in opposing corners. If they were directly across from each other, it pulls the eye to them. This, by offsetting seams, your eye doesn't go to it the way that it would directly across. So now you don't have to use the same exact size borders that I'm using, and you could even use 3 borders. That would be perfectly fine. If I was to want it to be more of a wall hanging, being the size that it is, I probably would have cut my first border at 1.5 inches. I probably would have gone with one of the very, very dark colors in this fabric. That would have been my first border. Then I would have done, for me personally, I would have done the same one that I did for the first border on there, and I would cut that at 2.5 inches, and ends up being 2 inches after sewn. And then I would have gone with this at 3.5 inches, and it would have been 3 inches sewn. So, excuse me, my allergies are acting up, and I have a sinus and ear infection that I'm working through, and so yeah. All right, so we will cut 2 strips. Okay, that's what I wanted to point out to you. So I already pre-cut mine to save on time, because we went over the cutting in the beginning. Cutting is the same. Now I went ahead and I sewed all 5 strips that I'm going to need. Now I'm not going to need a full 5 strips, but well, you have to cut the strip in the last strip in the size, the width of the fabric by whatever you're cutting it by. So 5 strips will do this, because I'm not needing a lot of inches on each of those ends. And then it's going to change the size of the width of this quilt top, and we'll check that measurement after we've sewn these on. So I believe 5 will do it. I might be wrong, but I think it will. Okay, so let's get this measured out and cut 47.25 inches. And I usually set something down this end so that my fabric doesn't move and slide down on me as I'm trying to get this straightened out for the cut. Now, one of the things that I do when I need to cut a 1/4 inch, and I am using my mat for these longer cuts, I can see the 1/4 inch down here, but when you get up here, you only see your hole mark. So I just make sure that the dashes for the extra 1/4 inch on this side of my ruler is on that main whole line. So it's on the 47-inch line, in other words. So I know it's that 1/4 of an inch going in on my ruler is on the exact 47-inch. The end of my ruler is on 47 1/4. That will be my cut. And I just check my dashes so that I make sure that my ruler is staying straight, because I wouldn't want it to be crooked in any way. So that's just an extra way for me to double check, is that those dashes 1/4 of an inch in from my ruler is on that line. Now if I was doing 4.5 inches, I would make sure that the lines for the 1/2 inch in going in on the ruler are sitting on that blue line for the 47 inches. And that just is an extra way to double check your measurement before you do your cuts. Okay, so that's one. And we need 2 of those. And since it's all sewn together, all 5 of the strips, just like you would do for binding, really, it will offset where the seams are cutting to as I go. Okay, I always checked, or I'd like to say always, but the majority of the time I remember to go and double check my measurement on both ends before I do my cut. Okay, so now we have our 2 first borders that we need. That will be going on the left and the right side of your quilt. And I will do the same thing that I did before. I will fold my top to my bottom, put the ends together so I can find the center. And then I just make a little crease there, or you can put a pin right in that crease now. So it's easier to find when you go to put your border on there. Okay. And then you will do the same thing for the border. You'll put your ends together. Find the halfway mark. Make a little crease. And then you're going to match up and I don't see my little crease. I think I see it, but I want to double check. And it never hurts to, sometimes when you're working with certain colors, it's hard to see a crease that you put in it. So it's really handy to stick a pin in it. And I'm going to stick it in from the back side on here, right on that crease. And then I'm going to match it up to the center on my top. I can pull that pin out. And then pin your center together. Okay. And I do use a pin there instead of a clip because it's more accurate to align them. And then I will take, and on each end, I will put these together. And I don't have my clips over at my cutting table, just some pins, so I'm just gonna pin that for now. So I've pinned the ends together on one on the top end, and now on the bottom end I will do the same thing, and I will match up my ends. So as I'm pinning or clipping, whichever you want to use, I will put a couple here, then a couple here, and another one here, and then the same on the top half. And that gives me the assurance that this is going to be neatly together. The longer that you need to make a seam, the more clips I put in. It keeps your fabric from shifting, because your fabric in the back, unless you're using a walking foot, and if you're using a walking foot, you'll get it won't have as much slippage in your fabric. But if you're just on a domestic and you're using your 1/4 of an inch foot, you will, if you didn't put enough clips and pins, or you didn't put any and you just went to sew it, when you get down to the end, you will have more fabric on the top than you have on the bottom. And that's because your feed dogs are feeding it just a little bit of a different ratio, of a different pressure, and your foot is putting pressure down onto it. Now, most modern domestic machines have built-in tensioning, and for the most part works accurately, but that doesn't change the dynamics of what happens with your fabric as it's being sewn. So by I mean, it doesn't have to be, the clips too close together, but I would, like I said, I would put one about there, two up from my center pin, and then one here in the center for this length. And then I feel pretty confident that when I get down to the end, everything matches up and makes me feel better, so I don't have to tear it apart. I also put a clip on each side. I not only pin my bottom section together, but I will put my sides together, and then I will put a clip here, and that also holds the bottom to here, so I know it's going to be a nice straight seam, so when I go to press it out, it'll look nice. So go ahead, sew your left side and your right side. We will press again so that our seam is facing outwards, and then we'll come back and we will take a look at measuring for our top and bottom. Okay, so once again, we're back at the cutting table. We have applied our final border on the left side and the right side. It's looking so beautiful. So here's something that I want you to remember in the future. We are going to put a top and bottom border on this. However, say I add my bottom border, okay? And I usually do my bottom and then do my top. I don't know why. It's just how I think we just build habits, and that's what we follow when we go to do things. There's no right or wrong. You can it doesn't matter which one you put on first. But here's the thing. I usually put my bottom border on. I'm using very wide borders for this. That's for me personally, for my class, because I need wider borders to practice on. And so I'll have them here, which will be nice. However, when I put that bottom border on, what if I say to myself, that's going to be too long for what I wanted. I don't want it that long. I would be adding, let me see how long it is now. I need to turn it sideways. Oh no, I was looking. Oh my goodness. I'm messing myself up. What am I thinking? Okay, so if I go from top to bottom, we'll forget that happened. My brain thinks too fast ahead of me. Okay, so for right now, we're at 47 inches. And let me see. Is that right? Oh yeah, 47 and a quarter. Okay. So, if I add that border onto the bottom, that will give me, quarter's gonna come off there. 6 inches to 47 will be 52, 53 inches. So say I say to myself, well, if I add the 6 inches up here, we'll be at 53, we'll be at 59 inches. But what if that's too long for where I want to put it? And that can happen. Not necessarily so with this one, but it does sometimes happen, even with different size borders. And sometimes I've put on borders as 8 and 10 inches wide for more work that I want a long arm at the end. So sometimes it does end up being too long, and so I will leave off the top border as if it's intentional, and it is intentional, and it gives it a different look with just 3 sides having a border. Just something to keep in mind for the future. So for now, for our next step, I didn't mean to sidetrack you, but I wanted to point out, and sometimes I've needed something to be wider. This is usually when I've created a center area and I'm just adding borders to get something to be wider or longer that I need it to be. And sometimes in that case, sometimes I only put a top and bottom border, or sometimes if I need it wider but not longer, I will just add 2 sides. And sometimes I've even done that and then put another border all the way around. So if I left it like this, where I only have that extra border on the left and right side, I could do one more border completely all the way around, and that would change the dimensions of the quilt as well. There's a lot that you can do with borders. These are simple borders. This will get you started, and as we go, we will be doing more creative borders, as I had showed in the beginning. Okay, so now we need to measure the width of this, and whatever panel you're working with when you do this. This is why I'm showing you the measuring part, because they can all be all kinds of different sizes. Okay, so what do we have? I have 46 inches there. I'm going to check it more in the center. .46 inches there. Nice. And we have 46 inches there. Great. That means I squared up my panel pretty well, which makes me happy. So we need 2 strips cut 46 inches. One for the top, one for the bottom. So I'm just going to fold this in half. I forgot to turn my light on. I don't know why I did that. So 46 inches, and I'm just going to write that down. And it was important for me to write that down because when I go to make my backing for this, I'm gonna need those measurements. Now when you are doing measuring for your backing, if you're taking it to a long armor, most long armors want you to have an extra 5 to 6 inches on each side. So you would take your width and your length, and if you're adding 5 inches to each side, that's 10 inches that you're adding on for the width, and 10 inches for your top and bottom. So you just need to keep that in mind when you're going to do your backing. Even if it's a whole cloth, the 108 inches, you need to know what your measurements are so you know what that piece needs to measure, and so forth. But anyways, that's how you do that. And even though I talk about some of these things in these little, as like subtopic in a different tutorial, often I've made tutorials on those topics themselves alone, and or will be making some in the future. Okay, so that's one at my 46 inches. Now I saw where my seam was on that, and I'm going to start at the longer end of this piece so that the seam is further down instead of more centered. Okay. And this is my excess piece left over from my border. And I just set that over in my scrap pile, and someday when I have time, I cut these into pieces or fold them up and put them away. It's a job all its own, taking care of scraps. All right, so now we have our top and bottom strips cut. We're going to use the same method that we did for doing the left and right side. We'll put right sides together, get it all centered, pinned or clipped, and we will come back for our final look. Now on here, before I go put these on, you'll see that by sewing all my borders together, all my border strips together, when I cut these, my one seam is down here and my other seam is here. So they'll be offset on my quilt. And I will put, like, on the top, I'll put the shortest seam up there, and I'll put this one down bottom, and it will be barely, they won't show up as much once they're quilted on. So go ahead, put those on, and we'll come back and we'll take a final look at our quilt. Okay, so now we have all sides of our border sewn on. And it's so beautiful. I will take a picture that I can post for you and hopefully add to the end of the video so you can see it. So we have 59 inches long. And the 46 inches wide. I believe we still might have some kits for this available on Seaside Quilting Supplies, LLC. Their Etsy store is Fabrics by the Sea, all one word. And you can join us for our private quilting group, Seaside Quilting on Facebook. Every Tuesday evening we have a sip and shop live where we sell fabrics, notions, all sorts of things that have to do with sewing and quilting. So I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial. You can use this method with any quilt top or panel for putting on your borders. And these are just simple borders, and you can do as many borders as you like and build them out in different sizes. It is nice to do them in equal increments. So where I went 3.5 inches here, I doubled it and went 6.5 inches here. That was unfinished measurements, of course. And I could have even added one more border even wider and maybe gone to, say, a 9-inch blocks, and it stays all in increments of 3 inches. Or I could go with even numbers and work my way out. It's all in what you want and how many borders that you would like to have for your quilting. I hope that you've enjoyed the tutorial. If this is your first time watching, please click the subscribe button before you leave. And next to subscribe, there's a little bell, and if you click on that bell, you can change how often you receive your notifications of postings on our YouTube channel. Thank you. Happy sewing.